I request the Honorable Minister to speak.
Thank you, Dharanidharan. Thank you for inviting me to such a distinguished panel, and my thanks to my fellow panelists for joining us as in my capacity as founder of the DPF. And I apologize again for running a bit late. It's just been a bit of a difficult day. I think the topic is almost not worth discussing, in the sense it's such a black and white issue of how deeply the lack of institutions and the kind of menace of corruption affect the country's prospects. I don't think there can be any debate about it. But I thought, as somebody sitting in active governance, maybe I'll give a few thoughts that guide our policy on how we try and control these things. Let me start by saying that in my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, but in almost no democracy can you separate money and politics. Sooner or later, money is used as a lubricant to buy access to communication or buy access to policy making. I've lived about 20 years in the US and a few years in Singapore, and functioned professionally in, I don't know, many 20 or 30 countries. And so I've not yet found a place where there's completely zero link between campaign contributions, lobbying, and the function of democracy. But what I think is really the dividing line is how insidious, how much of it is documented, how much of it is undocumented, and how far has it penetrated into the culture of society, down to every house, down to every street. And in some other context, I made the observation that I don't think, in Tamil Nadu, at least to my knowledge, there's not a single person I've ever met who follows every law, even if it's simply the traffic rules that they violate. So I think, our society has evolved to a point where it's seen as acceptable that everybody cuts corners everywhere. And, surely the culture gets set at the top. So I'm not suggesting that society was rotten to start with. The fish has started rotting from the head down, but now it's rotten all the way to the bottom. If I go back and say, let's start from my understanding of first principles, at some level, democracy, the movement of power away from a dollar to a one man, one vote, was supposed to be the antidote to the kind of inevitable end of all capitalist models that Marx wrote about, or Piketty says he's documented with data in his book, which is that the returns to capital keep increasing, the returns to labor keep going down, and at some point you end up with social strife and blood on the streets. And this notion that democracy, because you start empowering people equally, irrespective of whether they're rich and poor, is the antidote that can keep things in balance, is a powerful notion, in theory. In practice, I think, as many have spoken, it really comes down to the institutions of democracy, not just the courts, the election commissions, but simple things like the motor vehicle department, or the cooperative society that supplies rice rations, right? Because if you have functions that, if you have institutions that function in a democratic way and implement a level playing field, then you have the likelihood of kind of not just better social outcomes, but also better economic outcomes, and you have a more cohesive and a more progressive society. And inherently, many of these things are designed with built-in conflicts of interest, right? If I'm a minister, I'm the one that has to approve the policy, and somebody below me has to sign off on the tender. The chance of rent-seeking or the chance of rigging or nepotism are inherently very high, because especially in the function of democracy that we see now, it's almost kind of a mythical cultist leadership with no real voice for the legislature. It's basically the administration. The legislature died slowly till the enactment of the Anti-Defection Act, and then it died quickly in terms of independence. And the judiciary, especially the last few years, has become perhaps a shadow of itself, perhaps not even that. So we have these systems where the functional aspects of democracy are not visible, are not evidenced, are not felt. And then, of course, the question that we think about is which is the chicken and which is the egg? Is it that functional democracies with robust institutions lead to economic success? Is it that economic success drives people to demand more functional democracies and more of their institutions? And which is the chicken and which is the egg? I think if my limited reading, I'm not anywhere near the scholar that the others are, and practicing politicians always have low ratings, I would say, in this context. But to me, I think it's very clear that institutions create good outcomes rather than good outcomes create institutions. Though there's some mutuality and there's some cyclicality, pro-cyclicality. And I think one of the better discussions I heard on this when I was a banker, we had Neil Ferguson. At that time, he was at Harvard. I don't know where he is now. Talk about his book, The Great Degeneration, and talking about how the decay of institutions was leading to economic failures and increasing, spread of wealth, wealth disparity. So, I think if we look at corruption, the only marginal learning that I've had since I came to office is that corruption is not only about deadweight loss to the economy. It's not only about unfair outcomes. It's not only about incentivizing the wrong behavior for people to come to office. The biggest problem of corruption that I have seen is that it exacerbates inequality at the micro level. Right? If I go to a street in my constituency, or if I go to a housing colony, which was otherwise very poor area, a slum, converted and set up as a multi-flat housing colony. What I find is that the humans who have access to a motor where they can tap illegally and draw the water before it goes to the rest of the people, or those who can pay off the engineer and kind of build their house wall a little bit into the road. These guys start the ball rolling. And then, since there are no consequences for that, everybody does the same thing. And pretty soon, you have like the worst of all outcomes, where a few people have garnered the resources, and everybody believes that's the way the world ought to work. So there's this kind of social corrosive value of corruption, which far exceeds what I first thought of as just deadweight loss or inopportune gain through rent seeking. I mean, I was very interested to hear both the scientific perspective and the research papers and the many examples of quantifiable effects observed or detailed, and also to hear a perspective from, we live in a relatively kind of, what can I say, safe cocoon in places like Tamil Nadu. And I think when we hear from people like Seema, we understand the full depth of the problem. And what I take away the most is that she's still hopeful, because I think, looking from outside, while we feel a bit protected and a bit secure, and we know that election after election, we keep getting results that indicate certainly the whole country is not subject to the same kind of malady. It's still a bit unnerving to hear the other side. Maybe I'll just add one thing. I was talking to a very senior political figure I met for the first time recently, and he was making the point that the fundamental difference between the North and the South is not that there's great difference in values and all. There is or there isn't, I don't know. But he feels like in the South, there's been enough of a track record of growth and a track record of good outcomes so that the political debates center around, the future. Who will get how much? Will you grow by this or that? And it's a I can give you a brighter future, so vote for me kind of approach. And he was saying that in the North, a lot of it is profoundly affected by the fact that they don't see any hope. They don't see any future. They're not talking about growing the pie. They're talking about the pie that exists, whether it is the natural resources or the handout from the union government, which most of these rich, the northern states are poor enough that they get significant net handouts taken from southern states like Tamil Nadu. That really it's only a question of how do we share the spoils and which caste and which community gets to sit in the top slot and which takes the spillovers and so forth. So I was a bit taken aback because he's a very senior person, but that's a very disheartening kind of outcome. And I mean, it's not central to the topic here, but my point is that if despite that, from that environment, if there's still hope that there's a path out of this, then maybe that's what I take away the most. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. There's a question from Mr. Shankar. Shankar, can you go ahead?
Thank you, Dharani. And Dr. PTR and Seema gave a brilliant overview of how corruption happens in all levels of the society, from the lowest level, like someone in a street extending his housing wall. And Seema was saying there is people getting post-retirement jobs is also a corruption. But when we speak about corruption, my question is the focus too much into elected representatives, parliamentarians, and governments? While the focus is there, we have local polls and all those things, debates going on around. But there's another corruption, which is policy corruption. I mean, influencing a policy with or without a money happening. And what is the kind of checks and balance we could bring in there as a state government? Because we have a lot of limitations. Say, for example, the two latest corruptions, in my opinion, would be NSE, National Stock Exchange. It's also a huge corruption that is happening. And nowadays in Supreme Courts, there is sealed covers. I mean, any argument, then the argument gets closed. If someone says, I'll give you a sealed cover, which is also a form of corruption. So when elected representatives have a check and balance through local poll or other means, so what is that state government could do to contain these kind of policy corruptions? Since Dr. PTR also is here, I thought I'll ask this question.
If I say something, it'll be like I'm talking my own book, but I'll say it anyway. Though the root cause of this may have been politicians, and even politicians justifying this, I spend money to get here, therefore I need to get it back. Incidentally, that's why I never paid for votes in any elections that I ran, because I said, it's not that I don't have the money. I don't want to have a reason to take any money out. So I'm not paying. So you can hold me accountable that if tomorrow you hear I've taken money out, I can't say, is the money I put in for elections. But I think that was the beginning, and maybe that's the root cause. But today, you're right. I think the kind of corruption that happens in the bureaucracy on the ground, in the judiciary, I think those are the things that are much, much more both, what can I say, profoundly hope eradicating, right? I mean, I don't know how else to say that. If you can get a kind of outcome like that in one of the top courts of the country through that process, then what is left? Politicians have to get re-elected every 5 years or less. So somewhere we have to at least pretend to be something and pretend to have some limits. I mean, there are people who are completely unaccountable and who have no such term limit, right? So, yeah, I mean, though, as I say, I'm talking my own book, I don't think the biggest problem here is political elected representative corruption, though it's hard to fix the bottom without fixing the top. But that can change. Like in my department, I found a lot of cases, or in my many departments, I found a lot of cases of kind of rent seeking for postings and transfers and stuff like that. So I did two things. First, I put in a very transparent system of tracking all requests and stuff and making it go through the process of the guidelines and so forth. But the second thing I did, I fired or transferred a whole lot of people and brought in a whole lot of new people and changed the procedures and say as long as it's one-off or minor promotions, it can happen by the officer itself. But, if it's like mass transfer of 200, 300 people and all that, it has to come to me. I have to sign it. And that actually is interesting because I think the original design was like that because, you can't move that many people without it going a file to the minister. But ironically, second order effects of corruption, those who are collecting money for that changed the procedures and made sure somebody junior signed and it didn't come to them so that they couldn't get prosecuted for it. You see, they can influence the outcome by a phone call, and somebody else has the signature on it. So, ironically, the more corrupt you are, the less you want your name on the paper and you want somebody else to take so you delegate more, seemingly delegate more, and somebody else takes the fall. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know what we can do. I mean, as the HR minister, I would say we're improving certain things. As the finance minister, I say we're increasing the control of audit. We're removing them from their home departments. We're bringing them in. We're going to fundamentally revamp the entire audit process, make sure they're really arm's length. We are, recruiting more transparently only through the Public Service Commission. We brought new laws that you can't do kind of private recruitment if you're a PSU, for example. And we are giving them a lot more training and emphasizing a lot more things. One of the things that I've been recommending, I don't know if we'll ever get to it, but when I was a banker, after the global financial crisis particularly, most regulators insisted that at least all functional bankers, maybe not the managing directors and all that, had to take certain online courses and pass online tests every year. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, Anti-Money Laundering, etc. And what those tests did, of course, they kept reminding you what the rules were. So, in theory, they had that primary effect. The secondary effect was that without doing it, you couldn't continue to function. The next effect was that, if you ever got caught doing something wrong, you couldn't say, I didn't know. And the most important effect was that at least they kind of made sure that other people would tell on you if they caught you because they knew for a fact what was not on, what was acceptable or not. And so, I mean, to the limited extent I said, no, it must be extended to managing directors and everybody too. We must set the tone from the top. So, all these certifications were done. So I've been saying to my secretary here that we must do some of these trainings. They have to pass an exam. It means they actually have to have understood the training to pass the exam. It's not automatic. It's not that trivial. And then they have self-certified that they now know that what they're doing is wrong if they get caught doing something wrong because they've gone through the certification. So, these kinds of practices I think we can bring, but these are more the lower to mid-level, but many in number, hundreds of thousands of employees of the state government, probably the union. When it gets to the top and all that, it's hard for me to see how, but then the judiciary is broken in so many hundreds of ways that this might not be the biggest problem for the judiciary, right? The gap between filing and listing, the selectiveness in processing, the cold storage of lakhs and lakhs. Don't get me started. So I'll just stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Sergey. Thank you, Seema. Very enlightening. Thanks for your views. And I hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you.